Hello everyone, Stakuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Now, from our last episode, a lot of you guys really wanted the full story of the trial of the Templars. So, well, let's go ahead and get into it. As we had talked about last time, this whole trial was something that was manufactured by Philip IV of France, the king here. And it all began with very little warning on Friday, October 13th, 1307. Because it was on this day that every Templar in France was arrested. Or at least that is what is supposed to have happened. Some Templars no doubt did escape with some forewarning. But this would lead to a series of persecutions that would go all the way from London down to Cyprus. And once they were caught, well, here's where the torture would begin. In order to deal with such terrible heretics, the King of France called for torture. These methods were tried and tested: starvation, sleep deprivation, solitary imprisonment, relentless questioning, shackling, racking, foot burning, and something called strappado, which this is a device that yanks the victim's tethered arms behind him until he is raised from the ground and his shoulders are dislocated. One of the Templars, Ponsard of Gissy, later described having his arms tied so tightly behind his back that blood would flow from under his nails, and that he was being kept in a pit so small that he could only take a single step in any direction, an experience by which he said that death by decapitation, or burning, or even being scalded with boiling water, well, any of these were going to be preferable to that. Over the course of 4 years, more arrests, more trials, more torture would occur. And it wouldn't be until around 1311 or 1312 that the church would finally step in and give its final verdict. The Templars were to be crushed. It was in December of 1313 that Pope Clement turned his attention to the punishments that were being handed out to the Templars' master, James of Molay, and 3 of his surviving colleagues. You had Geoffrey of Charnay, Hugh of Pyrard, and Geoffrey of Gonneville. What would need to happen is that the Pope would have to appoint a panel of cardinals, and they would examine the 4 brothers. They would then hear one last round of evidence and decide the Templar sentence. Though, of course, all that at that point was a sham. Everyone pretty much knew what the final verdict was going to be. On March 18, 1314, a crowd gathered outside of a raised platform that was set outside of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. This was to see the condemned elderly men and the cardinals with their wide-brimmed hats that were going to announce what penalty they were going to suffer. According to one writer, William of Nanges, he recorded that he had seen James of Molay and his colleagues examine that day. Their penances were to be exemplary and severe. Though at this point for them, it wasn't actually execution. For them, arguably, it would have been worse considering this was medieval times: perpetual imprisonment. Now, to be fair, you're not exactly going to have a very long life in a medieval dungeon anyway, so it might as well be a death sentence. But this was going to be one that you were going to suffer in for many, many years in very terrible conditions. And for James of Molay, who had already been in prison for 6.5 years, this was simply too much. Much to the shock of the audience around him, he actually decided to speak out. As one of the cardinals was lecturing the crowd, James interrupted him and began to argue for his innocence. Geoffrey of Charnay also joined in, saying that both men had suffered from injustice. They berated the cardinals and, without any regard to what they had already confessed, began to deny everything. But it was really only those 2, because behind them, James and Geoffrey, Hugh of Pyrard, and Geoffrey of Gonneville, they kept quiet. Each man understood what was happening here. If they stayed silent, then this means that they were going to accept the punishment of imprisonment and be able to live. But to speak out, to challenge authority, well, that meant that you were relapsing as a heretic, that you were not seeking forgiveness, and the worst punishment was to come your way. For the crowd watching, this was terrifying. This was a massive surprise. This entire thing, bringing these men out in front on this raised podium, presenting them to the crowd, this entire thing was supposed to be the state presenting prisoners for their own kind of display. The fact that it was turning against them now meant that it had to be silenced quickly. James continued to rave about being innocent until a sergeant that was standing nearby stepped forward and struck him across the mouth, then dragged him by his hair into the chapel. Whatever hint of due process could have existed at this point was simply gone. There was no coming back from it. Both Geoffrey and James were hauled off. The intention was for both of them to be held until authorities could determine what exactly they were going to need to do with them. But as word soon spread throughout the city of the scenes that occurred at Notre Dame, within hours news had reached Philip IV, and by this time the king was not very pleased. He consulted with his advisors, and rather than reach out to the church in order to determine a plan of action, he instead called for the men to be consigned to the flame. As evening fell on March 18th, James of Molay and Geoffrey of Charnay were taken into a little boat to an island in the river of the Seine known as the Ile de Javaux, not far at all from the gardens of the royal palace, and 2 pyres stood waiting, the wood already smoldering. The entire scene at this point played out rather calmly. James of Molay stripped to his underclothes, and without shivering or showing any signs of being afraid, he was tied to the stake and asked to be allowed a prayer. Once finished, he added, "God knows who is in the wrong and who has sinned. Soon misfortune will come to those who have wrongly condemned us. God will avenge our deaths." And it is here that the story of the Templars comes to an end, at least officially. There was all kinds of rumors of how many Templars had actually escaped their destruction. Legends would even arise later of the Templars taking secret treasure with them, heading all the way over to the New World before Christopher Columbus had ever actually managed to be there. As for whether there's any validity to these statements, more than likely no. Some Templars surely did escape. As for how many or where exactly they went, we don't really know. At this point, the entire order, if it still existed at all, went underground. But everyone, that is the end of today's episode. Please let me know what we should do in the comment section below. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, guys.